Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has released a report on human rights violations in the United States in 2022, revealing the deterioration of basic rights and freedoms of the American people. And the U.S. regularly examines the human rights record of every country around the world. Why doesn't it show abuses in its own country, or how it violates human rights internationally? And how much chaos has the U.S. brought to the world in the name of human rights? To discuss these issues and more, I spoke with Dr. Mmembe, President of the Socialist Party of Zambia. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for speaking with us, Doctor. Every year, the U.S. publish, human rights record on every country but itself. What do you make of that? Some people accuse the U.S. of using the so-called human rights to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, in particular the countries they are not happy with or they see as rivals. What do you make of that?
The pious arm of human rights that the USA waves all the time is hypocritical. This is the country that has invaded other countries, killing so many people, including children. This is the country that has appropriated the resources of other countries, leaving those countries helpless. Look at Iraq today.
20th anniversary of...
20th anniversary. What is happening to the Iraqi oil money? When Iraq sells oil, all the money goes to the USA. It's the USA government that decides how much to give to the Iraqi government to use. The Iraqi government has to submit a budget to the USA to get its own money after 20 years of that conflict. Is Iraq independent? Is Iraq sovereign? Iraq today is a colony of the USA. This is the country that occupies other countries' territories. For how long have they been in Guantanamo, on Cuban soil? A small island, the whole country of the USA, a huge territory, they still go and grab a small territory, not very far away from its own country, from its own coast. They have been occupying it for how many years?
Several decades.
The Cubans have been crying, give us our land. The USA does not respect the territory. Can really the USA claim Guantanamo to be their territory?
Right.
You can understand the same behavior in Taiwan. Same behavior. If today China or Russia went and did the same in Hawaii, what the USA is doing with Taiwan, would the USA accept it? They say, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Does the USA do unto others as it would like them to do on itself?
This is an interesting perspective of the point here. You mentioned about the equality among sovereign nations. That's an exercise of democracy, based on equal footing and expressing one's wish or one's needs or demands equally in the international community. Do you think there's enough democracy in terms of that respect?
If you don't respect the territories of other people, those territories are occupied by human beings. How can you respect human beings when you don't respect the territories which they occupy? How can you respect a human being when you don't respect the privacy of their home, the dignity of their home? A homeland is something very important to any human being. Every human being on this planet has a homeland. The homeland is their house. It's their home. That's why it's called homeland. You don't just get into somebody's house. You don't just get into somebody's country and interfere. If you don't respect the sovereignty of a territory, you cannot respect the human being who lives in that territory. You cannot claim to be committed to their democratic rights. You cannot claim to be committed to their human rights. What are human rights without a homeland? What are human rights or democracy without sovereignty? When your rights can be trampled on, when your leaders can be toppled anytime, when your leaders can be killed anytime. Look at what they did to Saddam Hussein. Look what they did to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Look at what they do to other people's leaders. Look even at the attitude, the arrogance towards other people. They never respect the leaders of other countries.
Interesting point you mentioned about respect for sovereignty. Part of the justification for the U.S. invasion of Iraq is to plant the seed of democracy in the Middle East, in addition to the so-called non-existent weapons of mass destruction. Is there a full-fledged democracy in Iraq now?
We have 20 years. Iraq today is ungovernable. It's a failed state. Since the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, is Libya today more democratic since 2011? Is Libya today more organized? Is Libya today more stable? It's a failed state. Wherever they have been, there are problems. Have they brought peace and stability and democracy and respect for human rights to Syria? Without the intervention of the Russians, where would Syria be today? They would have overrun that people. How many countries has the USA toppled? How many coups d'etats have they carried out? How many assassinations of leaders of other countries have they carried out? How many citizens of other countries have they killed? How many citizens of other countries have they arrested and detained and released without charges?
Well, in addition to the lack of respect for sovereignty or abuse of human rights, what about the record of the human rights record inside the USA?
Look at the treatment of black people.
George Floyd?
Yes. And when did black people start voting in America? The USA became independent in 1776. When did black people who were taken there against their will, when were they given the right to vote? It's not very long ago. Can you claim equal rights for black people in America? Go to American jails today. The majority of the inmates are black people. In a country where the blacks are a minority, but in prison they're the majority. Why? Are black people generally bad people? Is there something that can be done about that?
It's more than a human rights issue, it's a racism.
Yes, they're racist. Part of the hatred for China is racism. They cannot accept that a country that is non-white can surpass them economically and in so many areas of human achievements, of human endeavor. They can't accept that. But it is happening, it's unstoppable.
Human rights, it seems also is a bit controversial sometimes when it comes to the definition. For example, some countries or some people would stress the fundamental rights to access to clean water, health, decent living standard, etc. Others, mostly Western nations, they would stress very much about the political rights, like the rights to casting a ballot or voting in the procedure, the procedure of practicing democracy. What's your point?
When people go to vote, who do they vote for? Do they vote for themselves? Do they vote for other people? When it comes to other rights like access to clean water, access to food, who do they feed? Do they feed themselves? Do they put water in their own mouths or in the other person's mouths? They care about voting Because those poor people do not vote for themselves, they vote for them. They don't set a political agenda for themselves, they follow an agenda set for them. When it comes to the things that really matter, to food, to water and other things, it's about those individuals. So they don't care about those individuals. When a black person votes in America, who is he voting for? When a black person is eating in America, who is he eating for? In whose mouth does he put food? He's not putting food in Biden's mouth. But when it comes to vote, he's voting for Biden. So the vote matters because it's going to Biden. The food doesn't matter because it's going into that poor black person's mouth.
Globally, obviously there are differences in terms of democracy, but then if you look at, for example, the United States in 2021, they hosted the first democracy summit, and they do it again at the end of March, obviously. So some people say the US is attempting to use democracy as a tool, if not a weapon, to divide the world, to advance their, let's say, geostrategy, to contain the rise of China. They divide the world as democracy versus autocracy, and labeling countries as autocracy, authoritarian instead of democratic ones. How do you make of that?
They don't hide their intentions. That's the goodness with them. They say it very clearly. It's either you are with us or not with us. What does it mean to be with them? To be with them means to do their will, to live according to their will, to their dictates. When they say jump, you jump, then you're with them. If you don't, you're not with them. These summits are there to divide the world between those who they call dictatorships, who are not with them, and those who they call democracies, who are with them. If you are with them, you are not a dictator, even if you are one. We have seen this in Africa. We had Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. For how long did they sustain him? Mobutu had no elections. Mobutu squandered the resources of his country. He was still there dying. It didn't matter. They had the apartheid regime in South Africa. They were their friends. Was apartheid South Africa democratic? They had the white minority racist regime in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. They were their friends, they supported them. Was that a democratic regime? Was there a democratic dispensation in Rhodesia? They supported Pinochet in Chile, who toppled an elected government with their assistance. He was working for them. Did they care that Pinochet killed so many people? Did they try Pinochet for violation of human rights? For mass murders? What did they do with in Indonesia with Suharto? How many communists were killed? Almost 2 million communists killed in Indonesia. Have the Americans raised the banner of human rights? Has anybody been arrested for genocide? No. How many people did they kill in Vietnam? How many? Has anyone been tried for the murders in Vietnam?
But then, if you look at for example, the coverage of China in the Western press or in remarks by Western officials, in particular US officials, they often refer to China as the biggest, or top challenge or biggest threat to the US existence. How do you understand that kind of allegation or criticism?
You can understand why they are worried about a country like China. Because China is working in the opposite direction to them. China is working to free other people and free itself from being plundered, from being humiliated. This is the country that has, the USA is a country that has thrived, survived, prospered from slave trade, cross-Atlantic slave trade. They enslaved the Africans for centuries. They plundered the resources of Latin America, the resources of Africa, the resources of Asia. They plundered even the resources of Europe. This is the country, if plunder today, exploitation of other people is removed, the USA will not be the powerful country that it is today. If there is equality in the dealings with each other, the USA ceases because it doesn't know how to deal with other people on an equal basis, with other nations on an equal basis. It gets lost. It's worried today with the multipolar world that is emerging because its hegemonic interests are being threatened. It's not China per se, it's the interests of the Americans that are being threatened with a world that is more equal, that is more fair, that is more just. They can't survive in that world because their methods of existence are based on plundering other nations, on humiliating other nations, on exploiting other nations.
Recently, the Chinese side proposed this global civilization initiative calling for cooperation and coordination among different civilizations, while stressing the fact that there are a variety of civilizations around the world. What do you make of that?
The concept itself of global civilization initiative, it shows the care, the respect for other people. Yes, we are on the same planet, but we have been living differently in various parts of this planet for centuries. And we are at different stages of our own development. A superiority complex leads to many problems. When you want to make other people feel they are inferior to you, it's not a path to a peaceful world. So you can see the clarity of President Xi, of the CPC, in terms of the future of this world. You cannot build a future world that is peaceful, that is fair, that is just, that is humane, without respect for others.
Let's have a short break. We will continue our discussion right after this. Welcome back. Earlier, I also spoke with Senator Mushahid Hussain, chairman of the Pakistan Senate Defense Committee and co-chairman of the International Conference of Asian Political Parties, to get his opinions on this topic. Let's have a look. Recently, you pointed out the problem of political tribalism in some democracies, which sacrifices national interests for party politics. Tell us more in that respect.
You see, I made that statement after my recent visit to the United States, because I lived in Washington, D.C., and I was studying in Georgetown University School of Foreign Service for 4 years, and I worked in the U.S. Congress also as an intern. So I was struck by the fact that the American political system has become very divisive and very on a collision course. And by political tribalism, I meant that it's almost like a Republican-Democratic civil war in Washington now. For example, if you listen to CNN, they will always be attacking Trump. If you listen to Fox News, they will always be attacking Biden. And there's no meeting ground. So this reflects, in my mind, a tribal mindset, that you are confined to the cocoons or the narrow clannish interests of your either political party or your political base. So that's why I said it's political tribalism.
Is that part of somehow an inalienable part of democracy?
No, it is not. It is
too extreme?
Yeah, it's too extreme. And this is against society, because society has different views. And if you just have this unending internecine civil war of sorts, political polarization, conflict, confrontation, fighting on every issue, then the interests of the people suffer. Democracy is supposed to serve the interests of society and the people as a whole, not the interest of one small group or clan or vested interest or a lobby or one political tribalism reflecting a certain narrow political interest. So it is contrary to democratic norms.
Right. Speak of this divisiveness you mentioned in the United States. Well, there is one thing, there's one consensus very strong in the U.S. That's about hostility, a growing hostility against China. Both Republicans and Democrats, they do agree upon China is our greatest challenge or even the enemy. They are joining hands and agree with each other to be tough, or politicians are competing to see who is tougher on China.
I'm very disappointed with that. And I recently addressed a conference in Washington, D.C. I said, what is the China threat? How does China threaten America? Has China invaded or occupied the United States? Has China damaged the American economy? Has China attacked any American interests? It's just in your mind, you're conjuring up a threat because you want to divert attention away from your own domestic problems. And unfortunately, this was mentioned by a very famous American president, Eisenhower, when he retired in 1961. He said in America, there's a military-industrial complex. That military-industrial complex is a war machine. They need to feed, they need to be nurtured through a so-called enemy. And if there's no enemy, then you conjure up an enemy, you create an enemy, and now they say, oh, China is the enemy. What is the basis? And I find it very undemocratic that nobody challenges this perspective. In democracy, you will say, okay, if you say China is the enemy, there should be a contrary view. And there was a very good article on this issue in the Foreign Affairs magazine in America, The New China Scare. And they said how this new China scare is being created, and it has no basis in reality. And this I read, I think last year or so, in January, February issue of the Foreign Affairs. So even some sane voices in America are saying, what is this so-called new Cold War all about? Why are you creating this so-called China threat on containment of China and so forth?
Yeah, geopolitics, let's say. It's a different,
But it's against the interests of the American people.
Yeah, even
it's against the interests of the American economy.
Exactly.
It's against the interests of world peace. It's against the interests of global stability, because the issues are such, they require cooperation, not conflict or confrontation.
Democracy, of course, in the recent years, we have, we had the first democracy summit in Washington, hosted by the United States. And interestingly, Pakistan rejected the invitation, refused to participate in the summit, saying that democracy summit or democracy now is being used as a weapon against other countries here, in particular China, Russia. And you played a role in that decision. Tell us in how democracy is used as a weapon, probably in geopolitics or competition.
The Western system is based on a lot of this, what is called the military-industrial complex. They're looking for enemies. In the past, there was a Cold War, they had Soviet Union, then they talked of the Muslim world after 9/11. Now it is China. So they have to attack China. There's nothing is good with China. They have to use every weapon, and human rights, democracy, trade, these are all being weaponized against China. And democracy is one thing they start talking of. Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, when their own situation we know very clearly, this is the same country that launched a war of aggression, which was illegal, which was unjust, and which was based on a lie, the Americans in Iraq. Totally, and we talk of democracy, and also the conduct has to be democratic in international relations, which means you respect other countries' independence and sovereignty, and you are more tolerant of different opinions. We don't find that democracy. So we felt that this so-called democracy summit, which was organized in 2021, was actually a propaganda ploy to put pressure on China, on Russia, or other countries. And a lot of other countries did not accept, and we refused to go there. Mm-hmm. And I hope that this time also we will take the same decision, hopefully.
Yeah.
Because you see, it's, we don't need a certificate of democracy from any country. And especially those countries who have double standards and whose own track record on democracy is rather dubious, if I may say so.
Well, Senator, I also want to have your comment on the recent visit, President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. This is obviously about the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Moscow. It's also about the Ukraine crisis. What do you make of the visit?
This again shows the contrast between China and some of its so-called Western competitors. While the US is erecting barriers, China is building bridges. Whether it is China's role in being an honest broker in the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement, which was historic, which we in the Middle East and the Muslim world have welcomed, and whether it is his visit to Russia, because it was already including the peace plan for Ukraine, and 12-point peace plan was issued before that. So I think China's role is extremely important. There is an outreach with all the stakeholders. There is a commitment to promoting peace and security through dialogue. Because if you don't talk to each other, then you end up fighting each other or talking at each other. So that the Chinese style of diplomacy is very different. It is engaging, it is cooperating, and it is doing so in accordance with the United Nations Charter and international law. So I think this is a very important visit, and this visit is extremely important also in the sense because since the Ukraine situation and the conflict, there is a new divide, a North-South divide. And I feel that the global South does not agree with what is being done in Europe, because that's seen as a European war, and it's not about us. And that has given us strategic space, we in Pakistan, and you can see whether it's India or South Africa or countries like Indonesia or Saudi Arabia or even Turkey, they are taking Iran, they are taking different positions on these. They feel we are not going to be part of a new Cold War. We want to be part of a new world order, which is based on win-win cooperation, which is based on connectivity, and which is based on consultation, not conflict, not war. Enough of the war. We have had that. And wars are too debilitating, especially in Asia and the Middle East. We have suffered enough. So in that regard, China is giving a different alternative worldview and a model of international relations, which is why China's approach on foreign affairs is being welcomed and is quite popular in the global South.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
so
speaking
much
with us.
It was a pleasure.
It was.
Thank you. All the best.